to the unit, the Middle Ages. This unit elaborates the history and evolution of costumes spanning the Byzantine, early and late Middle Ages, as well as the Rajput and Mughal era. The unit comprises 4 modules. Each module has a final review section that invites you to reflect on what you have learned. Let us begin by looking at the Byzantine period. This module focuses on the Byzantine costume. Constantinople was the capital city of the Byzantine Empire. It was selected by the Roman Emperor Constantine in 330 AD to be the capital of the eastern part of the Roman Empire. The city became a rich amalgam of Eastern and Western art and culture. Byzantine was constantly at war with a series of enemies: the Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Avars, Seljuks, Turks, and later Ottoman Turks. Even the Crusaders became enemies of the Byzantine Empire. At the head of the state was the emperor, who was the absolute ruler and the head of the Eastern Church. The emperor and empress lived in an elaborate palace. Landed nobility made up an important element in the provincial economic life and government of the empire. A well-developed civil service helped the imperial administration function by collecting taxes, administering justice, raising armies, and deploying them on the field. The aristocracy was one of wealth rather than bloodline, so ambitious young men could rise from one social group to the next, unlike the process in Western society. Education was important to wealthy families. Schools were built in some provincial areas, and Constantinople had a university. Women enjoyed an advanced status during the early period of the empire. Empresses were known to reign alone or as regents for minor sons. At the other end of the social scale were the slaves, both foreign captors and poor people who sold themselves into slavery in order to survive. The Byzantine Empire developed very detailed regulations about who wore what and when. Based on this and their status, individuals were assigned colors to wear. The city of Constantinople saw itself as a center for the preservation of the antique Greek and Roman culture. Writings and works of art were consciously preserved. Many of these treasures were destroyed when the Crusaders and Turks sacked the city. Most of the information on Byzantine comes from artwork. Artists decorated churches with mosaics. Other skills included carving of ivory and illumination, hand painting and lettering of manuscripts. Byzantine art displays a blending of classical and Middle Eastern motifs and forms of decorations. Most of the art of this period had a religious motive and often utilized traditional representation of people rather than realistic representations. In the early Byzantine tradition, artists began to depict evangelists in the classical costume worn in Rome of the 4th century. This convention persisted to the 8th and 9th century. Christ was depicted as a king and Mary as a queen. They were dressed in royal robes which symbolized their status. These stereotypes continued in use during the remainder of the Middle Ages and even beyond. For these reasons, depictions of religious scenes in Byzantine art must be evaluated carefully to ascertain whether figures are actually wearing costumes that are contemporary with the period in which the art was created. Fine textiles were worn in this period. Linen and wool were predominant fabrics. Knowledge of silk production gradually became known, and many cities started to produce silk for the Western world at a premium price. Brocades woven in Byzantine were specially desired. Often the designs used in the fabrics were Persian in origin. Christian fabrics were also depicted in complex woven patterns. When made into garments or wall hangings, these luxurious fabrics might be adorned with precious and semi-precious stones, small medallions of enamel, embroideries or appliques. Tunics could be either short, ending below the knee, or long, reaching to the ground. Some tunics were cut with sleeves fitted to the wrist. An outer tunic or dalmatic with shorter, fuller sleeves was worn over. It was worn with a belt. Short tunics usually had long sleeves, wider at the top and tapering to fit closely at the wrist. Working men frequently caught up the hem of the tunic and fastened it to a belt at a point just over each leg in order to make movement easier. Some tunics were decorated with clavi and segmente, square or round medallions that were placed in different areas of the tunic. Tunics of the wealthy were decorated with vertical and horizontal bands that were elaborately patterned with embroidery, applique, precious stones, or woven designs. When the tunic was belted, some fabric bloused over at the belt. This is known as the blouson effect. Fabrics had overall patterns and bands of jeweled decoration were placed at hems and on sleeves, with wide decorative yokes at the neck. Hose was worn as a leg covering with short tunics. Some had horizontal bands of geometric patterns. The pallium or lorum was a long, narrow, heavily jeweled scarf, possibly evolved from the toga with the folded bands that became part of the official signia of the emperor. Initially, it was draped up center, front around the shoulders, across the front of the body, and carried over one arm. It eventually became a simpler panel of fabric with an opening for the head, sometimes with a round collar-like construction at the head opening. From the 4th to 10th century, men tended to be shaven. Later, men tended to keep beards. Emperors wore crowns after often suspended strings of pearl. Other head coverings included a Phrygian bonnet-like style and several versions of a high hat with an upstanding brim surrounding a high-crowned turban, a smooth, close-fitting crown, or a soft crown with a tassel at the back. For women, the tunic or stola and the palla continued in use during the early Byzantine period. Gradually, the wide, long-sleeved tunic called the dalmatica was worn over an inner tunic with close-fitting sleeves. A simple veil worn over the head replaced the palla for some time. The palla returned to use in a modified form that wrapped around the body and covered the upper part of the skirt, the bodice, and either one or both shoulders. Women wore double-layered tunics. The inner tunic had long, fitted sleeves and the outer tunic had full open sleeves, cut short enough to display the sleeves of the inner tunic. Noble and wealthy women wore garments of elaborately patterned fabrics that were also decorated with jewels. Women of this class also wore jeweled belts and collars. After 1000 AD, ornamentation of tunics increased. Variation in sleeve styles included wide hanging sleeves or sleeves with long bands of fabric forming a sort of pendant cuff. Early representations show women wearing hair parted at the center, soft waves framing the face, and the bulk of the hair pulled back or knotted on top of the head. Women usually kept their hair covered with a veil or a turban-like headgear. They also wore a cap surrounded by a small tire. Royal crowns were heavily jeweled, diadems with pendant strings of pearl. The paludamentum was worn by upper-class women and the empress. It was fastened over the right shoulder with a jeweled brooch. This cloak was distinguished by a large square decoration, the tableon, in contrasting colors and fabrics that was located at the open edge of the breast. For common people, a simple square cloak replaced the hooded pinula of Roman times for general wear. In later periods, a semicircular cloak pinned at the shoulder or at center front came into general use. Shoes made of cloth, including silk or leather, were often quite open in the construction and ornamented with decorations like jewels, stones, pearls, enameled metal embroidery, applique, and cutwork. Some were tied and others were buckled at the ankle. Boots were worn high at the front and low at the back, ending below the calf, mostly by men. Jewelry was an integral part of the costume. The basic components of the military costume were the same as the Western Roman Empire. These included knee-length tunica, sagum, which is a cloak, tunica, cuirass, and close-fitting helmet. Fundamental changes occurred from the 5th century, notably the feminalia. Loose-fitting pants, brusque, was replaced by long hose that extended above the knees. They were bound over the knee with leather thongs or strips of wool or linen. The military tunica adopted longer sleeves like the dalmatica. Boots of varying heights replaced sandals. Greaves were no longer worn even in ceremonial dress. Imperial guards wore large gold torques around their necks to symbolize their dedication to the emperor and status as the emperor's personal bodyguards. Imperial guards also wore the squamata, a cuirass designed with a sheath of small metal scales attached to a leather or linen bodice. Ecclesiastical costume. Until the 5th century AD, biblical characters and church fathers were dressed in the same clothing as any other Roman of the day. A common representation of Christ was a shepherd carrying a lost lamb on his shoulders. Depictions of saints and apostles wear tunics of varying lengths and usually have a pallium draped about the shoulders. After Constantine established Christianity as the state religion, the church began to appropriate components of the imperial costume as priestly vestments. An ankle-length tunic of white linen with narrow, long sleeves called the alb was worn under the dalmatic, with huge sleeves also made of white linen or sometimes silk. There was a vertical length, single or double clavy of crimson or purple extending from the shoulder to the hemline. The same was repeated on the white dalmatic sleeves. The chasuble, a circular garment, was constructed from 2 semicircles or cut from single large piece of material. Each version with a hole in the center for the head was a more colorful and richly decorated garment. The outermost component of the priestly costume was the stole. It was a long strip of material, usually silk, draped around the shoulders in various ways. After the break of the Eastern and Western churches in the 11th century, the alb became the sticharion. The dalmatic became sakos with shortened sleeves and fuller girth, and the chasuble became the phenolin. The stole evolved into the omophorion, and epitrachelion was a later addition. The epigonation was a stylized scarf like a lozenge-shaped pendant attached by chain or cord to the belt and hung down the right front. It was made of heavy, stiff fabrics that are lavishly embroidered and jeweled. Tassels often decorated the bottom 3 corners. Patissa, the pastoral staff, was an insignia of bishops and abbots. The kalumaukion is a tall cylindrical headdress of black wool or felt. Sometimes it is covered by a veil of sheer linen or silk dyed black. Lappets were attached to either side of the veil, symbolizing that the priest has shut out the distractions and noise of the world. Monasticism began in the early 4th century. Men who were seeking more of a spiritual life began to live as hermits, devoting themselves to prayer, penance, and manual labor. By the 6th century, groups of monks banded together to form communities. Monks wore the simplest clothing. Garments were made from poor and coarse quality wool. An ankle-length tunic with long sleeves were worn. A hooded capelet was worn as a separate garment and sometimes attached to the tunic. Cowls were later attached to the neck of these hooded capes, and they became a distinctive feature of the monk's dress or habit. A work apron called the scapular was also worn. Heavy cloaks were worn during travel. A plain leather strap cord or woolen sash girded their tunics. They went barefoot mostly and sometimes wore simple reed sandals.